Previous to the pandemic, there were anywhere from 15 to 20 requests for military assistance to respond to domestic disasters. Between March 2020 and October of 2022, there was somewhere to the tune of 175.
Welcome to Canusa Street, a podcast at the intersection of the issues and policies between Canada and the United States. Here are your hosts, Scotty Greenwood and Chris Sands.
Welcome back to Canusa Street, everybody. I'm Scotty Greenwood with Canadian American Business Council, and I'm joined by my fabulous colleague, Chris Sands at the Wilson Center. Hey, Chris, how you doing?
I'm great. Nice to see you, Scotty, back on Canusa Street.
Back on Canusa Street. And Chris, a topic that we've talked about a lot, but it continues to be important, are the wildfires that are absolutely burning in Canada. And so we're going to have a broader conversation today, but I'm excited to invite our guest today from Team Rubicon, which is, you'll describe and he'll describe what they do, but they are a volunteer organization that brings military veterans into community service, and they're currently working on the wildfires, I think, in Nova Scotia. So we'll talk to Paul McCarthy about that. But before we get there, why don't I turn it over to you to introduce him?
Thanks very much, Scotty. And this is an exciting guest. Paul McCarthy is the vice chair of Team Rubicon in Canada. He has more than 25 years of professional experience, including time as a political operative, a public servant, and as a private sector advisor and manager. In his 20 years with the Canadian federal government, he's worked in the departments of industry, environment, labor, housing, and homelessness, as well as border services, just to name some of the departments our listeners will be quite familiar with. Now, while working at Veterans Affairs, he led the reconfiguration of financial benefits for veterans and the redesign of support services for Canadian Armed Forces members as they transition out of the military. The work resulted in unprecedented new investments and provided financial security for significantly more families. Paul has been an active supporter of Team Rubicon Canada, and I'll let him talk to us a little bit about that since its inception, and he's currently the vice chair of the organization. He's originally from St. John's, Newfoundland. Very nice to have you from St. John's, and has a Bachelor of Arts from Memorial University in Political Science and Business, but he lives in Ottawa now. Paul, welcome. This is great to have you.
Well, thanks so much for having me. This is wonderful.
Excellent.
Paul and I just met through a mutual friend of ours, Marlene Floyd, in Ottawa. And the moment I heard about the mission of the organization, I said, it would be great for you to share that with Canusa Street, because there is a Canada-U.S. story to be told, and it's quite compelling. So, Paul, Chris mentioned it a little bit, but can you talk about Team Rubicon and how, what it's all about and how you got involved?
Certainly. And so, you're right when you say that it very much is a Canada-U.S. story. Team Rubicon actually launched in the United States in 2010 when a couple of military veterans decided that they wanted to respond to the earthquakes in Haiti. They decided they wanted to try and go over and help, do what they could. And through that effort was born the whole idea of Team Rubicon. And so Team Rubicon is an organization that effectively leverages the skill sets and experiences of veterans to respond to disasters and humanitarian crises as well. And that organization has grown today, so launched in 2010. Today, they are an organization of over 100 full-time employees. They've conducted, I believe, somewhere around 1,100 missions. And they have an annual budget of about $50 million, just to give you kind of the size of the organization and the impact they would have. Team Rubicon Canada, so, I like to say that great ideas don't have borders. Certainly that's the case here. Team Rubicon Canada launched in 2016. And the first mission that we did here was in 2016 in response to the wildfires in northern Saskatchewan and Alberta. Now, people will probably remember that was the one that really decimated and effectively took out Fort McMurray. And in fact, I was just chatting with a friend recently who reminded me that fire actually burned for 18 months, which is really incredible when you think about it, before it was officially extinguished. But that was Team Rubicon Canada's first mission. And what we did there was actually quite unique. And I like to use this example simply because it does demonstrate the versatility of the organization. And while we have a lot of core competencies that we can talk about what we do, this just demonstrates the breadth of things that Team Rubicon can actually do to help communities. So on that mission, we went in and sifted through the debris of homes and helped people find items of personal value. So we were able to do that because we've got the equipment, we don the hazmat suits, we've got the proper training to actually do that in a very safe way. And what's unique about that is, you think about all the things that happen when a disaster like this strikes a community, and people, of course, are concerned about emergency shelter, emergency food, emergency clothing. But there are so many things that need to be done and that can be helpful to people who are trying to literally pick back up the pieces of their lives. And this is such a great example of something that who else would be able to do something like that?
Well, and when you've lost everything in a fire, all your belongings in the world, to be able to maybe find that one memento that's gonna be something that you hang on to, the artifact, that's meaningful for the people who've gone through it. But I have to believe it's also meaningful for these veterans who have served our countries, they've served in war, they come back home, and they're looking for the next really big, important thing to do. So I love what you're doing, Paul. I think it's an amazing, amazing mission.
Well, you're echoing my sentiments exactly. And, you asked how I became involved. At the time, I was the Director of Policy to the Minister of Veterans Affairs and the Associate Minister of National Defense. And I was accompanying the Minister to a luncheon with, at the time, Ambassador Bruce Heyman and his wife, Vicky. And at the end of the lunch, Vicky Heyman asked me if I'd ever heard of an organization named Team Rubicon. And I said, of course, no. She explained to me what it was that they did, and I was immediately taken by it because at the time we had a fairly aggressive new policy agenda that we were working to put together and implement. But there's only so much that you can do to help people. So financially is obviously very important. Helping people transition successfully out into civilian life is also very important. But when you think about what people miss when they move out of the forces, everybody talks about it. It's the sense of purpose, the sense of being a part of a team, the sense of being a part of a mission,
right?
Being with your comrades and taking on something and seeing it through to fruition, and the fulfillment that you get from that, and how good it is for your own kind of sense of value and sense of worth and your mental health. And that's something that nobody can really give you. And I thought immediately, wow, this is such a wonderful thing for that side of the equation, so to speak. And it actually is quite true. The volunteers love this work. So we always talk about a dual purpose of mission. You're helping the people in these communities, but of course, the volunteers also get something out of it.
I was going to ask, Paul, how do you choose when to get involved? Is it something where there's someone on the ground? I think about federal disaster declarations by a president or a governor, sometimes at the state level here in the U.S. But how do you get involved? Does somebody call you? Is there a bat signal for Team Rubicon, something like that?
A great question. And it's really a bit of it's a conversation, open conversation. So first and foremost, I would just state that we do not go where we are not invited. The last thing that anybody needs in a disaster situation are people who are there to help, but there's no specified role and there's no, plan to incorporate that into the response, right? And so it's a combination of us reaching out and others inviting us in. And so maybe a good opportunity to talk about what's happening in Nova Scotia currently, because we were invited in, and the Halifax municipality invited us to go in, and we are currently conducting a mission there. In terms of total volunteers, it's our biggest mission to date. I believe we're somewhere around 100 volunteers, and we are doing debris removal, sifting operations, spontaneous volunteer management, and of course we've got an incident command center set up there, and we're specifically helping the people of Tantalon. So for those listening, that's a community that was really hit hard by the wildfires, approximately 150 homes lost to those fires.
Wow, that's incredible. I guess I have another question on the other side, which is, how does someone, perhaps been in the forces, wants to get involved with you? How do you find your volunteers? Do you call them? Do they call you? Or if someone's listening and says, hey, I'd like to get involved, what do they do?
So that's exactly right. They reach out to us, and so, part of this is about building awareness that we're out there, that we're here to help, and that we're here to be a part of as well for those who want to volunteer. So we are currently in Canada about 3,000 volunteers strong and growing. Of course, we are in regular contact with the usual kind of people who play in the space. And so, the Canadian Armed Forces are well aware of our existence, as are all the emergency management offices throughout the country, which are first and foremost provincially managed. And then, of course, these responses take place at a local level, so at the municipal level as well. So we take in people who reach out to us, and we proactively reach out to others and ask them if they're interested in helping out. And we have predominantly veterans, but veterans of the military, but also veterans of other first responding disciplines, and what we like to lovingly refer to as kick-ass civilians.
Excellent. My last question, or at least for this set, I wonder, how does the cross-border piece work? Famously, Rubicon refers to the river that Julius Caesar crossed and then was committed to go all the way to Rome. But borders do matter, whether they're a river or not. And I have a flashback memory to Hurricane Katrina and the debates we had here in the U.S. about us receiving Canadian help. And were the guys who were going to put the power lines back up, were they certified in Louisiana? Were they allowed to do the work? And it was a huge thing that the governments were really trying to address. Is there a protocol that allows the volunteers to cross the border, or do you keep them mainly on one side or the other depending on the circumstances?
So that's a great question. And so first and foremost, I'll just say these two organizations are standalone. Obviously, there's a very tight-knit relationship between the two, but they are standalone organizations. During the pandemic, we had an issue where, because we do cooperate, and so I would just probably state at the outset, Canadian volunteers could participate in U.S. missions and vice versa. And, that's good for a whole host of reasons, because it helps each organization grow their capacity and their experience and their skill sets. The more you're participating on these missions, the more you learn, the more you kind of bring on board your own organization. But during the pandemic, we actually were presented with this challenge in that borders were shut down. And our CEO, Brian Riddell, reached out to the provincial government of Ontario, their emergency management office, to see what was going on with this, and could we actually kind of open the doors to the border for these Team Rubicon volunteers to come assist on some of the missions that we were planning at the time. And it was actually through those efforts that it actually got unlocked, because they started talking to the feds about this, and as it turns out, their interpretation of the policy was such that it did allow for this to happen. It just wasn't happening at the time. So they agreed to reach out to Border Services to brief them and allow them to know that they had taken this interpretation of the policy and that was permitted. And through those efforts, it kind of unlocked the ability to cross the border, and that resulted in us having people on missions that were really needed.
Well, so this is interesting. We're going to take a little break here, but when we come back, Paul, I want to talk to you about the relationship between what people expect of our military, and in the U.S. of FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, and a volunteer organization such as yours. So we'll be right back.
Are you red, white, and blue, or just red and white? Beaver or bald eagle? Ryan Reynolds or J-Lo? Canusa Street, a masterclass in cross-border relations. This is where Canada and the United States intersect on the policies and issues of our two great nations. But you know that already. That's why you're here. The question is, if you want more of this bilateral bonanza delivered directly to your inbox, and you know you do, how about signing up for Scotty Greenwood's weekly email updates on Canada-US relations? Head to cabc.co to sign up today. And now back to Canusa Street.
Welcome back to Canusa Street, everyone. I'm Christopher Sands. We have Scotty Greenwood here, and we're speaking today to Paul McCarthy, Vice Chair at Team Rubicon Canada.
And it's not I think there's a government relations firm called Rubicon Canada. This is a different one, if people are curious. This is a volunteer organization. And Paul, I'm interested in your thoughts about the relationship between what societies expect of our military. In the U.S., we really think of our military as being deployed overseas and in foreign areas, but also when they're so capable, and our militaries know how to build bridges and how to rescue people and do all of these things. How do you think about the relationship between a volunteer organization like yours in the U.S. and Canada that's former military, and the missions and the requirements and the requests that come in to active duty military and also emergency management services north and south of the border? How do you think about all those things?
You're really putting your finger on a salient issue right now, and this has been quite a debate happening certainly on this side of the border for quite some time. Back in the late summer, early fall of 2022, the House Commons Committee was having this exact debate. It's interesting, the head of the Government Operations Center was testifying, and he made the point that previous to the pandemic, so let's call it up to March 2020, there were anywhere from 15 to 20 requests for military assistance to respond to domestic disasters. Between March 2020 and October of 2022, so about an 18-month span, there was somewhere to the tune of 175 requests. So obviously, quite an increase. And it's a challenge because obviously, when Canadians are in need, the government needs to respond, and the Canadian Armed Forces are quite that able and capable force, and certainly just in terms of sheer capacity, right? But you've touched on it, Scotty, and that is, as soon as you start putting people into something other than what their core mandate is, you start to compromise their ability to actually achieve that mandate. And it's a very kind of salient ongoing debate, because how do you handle that, especially as these events happen with more and more frequency and more severity and require a bigger response? And so it's a challenge. And I would say this, Team Rubicon Canada is certainly capable of responding to a number of these things. We obviously do not have the size and the capacity of the Canadian Armed Forces, but you're talking about the same skill sets. We're the same people. And so provided that the scope of the mission is not too large, these are things that an organization like ours could take on. And so I would say that perhaps Team Rubicon Canada is actually part of the solution moving forward. Is it the entire solution? No, but it's certainly part of the solution. And it's tough because you don't want to compromise that ability to deploy overseas or in other arenas to pursue the policy objectives of the government through the Canadian Armed Forces.
Paul, one question that comes to mind. Scotty and I both have a little side interest where we raise money for different things. And so I guess maybe this is a softball question, but if our listeners are hearing about the work that you do and they want to get involved, they want to maybe contribute financially to support the work that you do, is that easy? Can they do so on your website?
Yeah, absolutely. So they can donate through our website. That's a simple thing. They can also volunteer through our website, or let's say they can raise their hand to have someone reach out to them to determine whether or not they'd actually make a great volunteer. And so that's simply through our website.
And do those contributions make up the bulk of your budget, or is there government support? I know you have volunteers, but it takes a village to pull these things together. So I know you have a lot of people.
Absolutely. Well, our business model allows us to run fairly lean. At the moment, we're just around 10 full-time employees. We're at a cadence of about 15 missions per year. We get our funding through individual contributions, through corporate sponsorship, through foundation sponsorship. We do have some one-time government money, which is wonderful, and programs that we were able to apply for because we met the eligibility criteria. But yeah, any support that we can receive specifically from individuals or corporate sponsors would be wonderful. And I wouldn't be able to quote you in terms of percentage here, but we do run lean, and the model allows us to do so because effectively, until we're actually in field, until we're actually conducting a mission, all that force that we have behind us through our volunteer network, that's actually just kind of laying to the side. There's no cost to that, right?
That's amazing.
Paul and I were talking about this the other day. I mean, if I got to design the world, all of those returning veterans would have an opportunity to enter a service program and actually get paid for it. So it would become a job, the job that you do after you retire. But anyway, that's a longer term thing. And Chris, apparently, I don't get to design the universe. It's an unfortunate reality.
We're working on it, Scotty. Right now, you've got Canusa Street. Tomorrow, the world.
If you wouldn't mind, could I go back on just one point? I just want to make one other point about this whole conversation about the Canadian Armed Forces responding. The other thing that I would say is that what Team Rubicon does is actually, in my humble opinion, a better vehicle to respond. And I'll give you an example. I believe it was September-ish of 2022, when Fiona hit the east coast of Canada, and again Nova Scotia and PEI. And Team Rubicon was actually first on the ground there. And at the invitation of Nova Scotia Power, we were first out helping them clear away the debris to open up critical routes again. And we continued to conduct many missions, both in Nova Scotia and PEI, in response to that storm. But at one point, we were actually conducting a mission, and we were actually shoulder to shoulder with the Canadian Armed Forces, who were also there to respond. And we were clearing away debris. And we had finished that specific job, and we were on a street, and we were adjacent to a number of homes that had downed trees. Now, we were able to actually just walk up to those doors, knock on the door, and say, "We can remove these hazards from your property if you'd like us to, free of charge." And of course, the homeowner said yes. The Canadian Armed Forces can't do that. They don't have the flexibility to do things like that. And it's also worth noting that, the people that we have in the field, they are trained specifically to do the task that they're there to do. So in this instance, they would be, it's what we call chainsaw teams. And they have very specific training to be able to do all that. Now, the Canadian Armed Forces does have the ability to do these things, but, specific training is important.
It's amazingly dangerous work. I don't know if people are really picturing in their minds right now what happens after a devastating storm. But when the trees are blocking the roads and they're bringing power lines down, it's hazardous. And you can't, imagine your grandmother is stuck and doesn't have power, has no way to get to the store, and can't walk in the front yard. I mean, these are real, everyday, in the moment, I need help. And so I think it's just wonderful to have somebody that can show up and say, we can help you. And by the way, we can do it safely. Because, you really don't want to just hand a chainsaw to somebody who's never operated one.
Absolutely. And that's a key part of our value add, in that, we plan out these missions, and before we press go, everything has been kind of lined up and buttoned down, so that when we're in the field, we're doing precisely what we're there to do with people who are trained to do precisely that.
So, but Paul, just a quick one and then we'll wrap. Why can't you in the story that you just told, why can't the military knock on your door and say, "Mrs. McGillicuddy, I'm here, and I'd be happy to clear your driveway"? Why can you do that and they can't?
We're a lot more nimble in that we have the flexibility because we're not constrained by orders, and we're not constrained by that type of specific skill.
Well, that makes sense. You don't just freelance, I guess, when you're a corporal in the armed services and say, "Hey, I think this is what I'm going to do this afternoon." Good point.
You got it. You follow orders, and orders are fairly specific. So, in that regard, I would say that the vehicle that we have is probably more designed to actually do this work.
Makes perfect sense.
Yeah. I know we're getting ready to wrap up, but I wouldn't mind making another point, which is really speaking to why it makes so much sense for this model. And this is part of the reason why it really resonated with me when I heard about the organization. And that is this stands true for both Canada and the US. the Canadian government spends billions of dollars training these people, and they spend, years and years and years and decades earning all that training. And so when they actually leave the military, they don't just hand in that skill set and that ability when they hand in their fatigues. They have that with them. And these people then are, throughout the country. So that is a major kind of capital human resource that's just laying dormant. Why not activate it when it's needed? And some of the attributes that they get while serving are just so well suited to this work. It's really important to note that being good at being trained is a thing. It's a skill set.
Right.
And these people are actually quite good at being trained. And so we provide training because it has to be specific to what they're going out in the field to do. And the other thing is that they also are quite good at bringing calm and organization to an area hit by chaos. And those two things are kind of intangibles, but they make the models so perfect for what's being required and what's being asked of them.
Well, it's really a beautiful effort and a wonderful story of hope and community service at a time when we really need it. So Paul, thank you so much for telling us the story of Team Rubicon, and Chris, thanks for mentioning how to get involved. We will put that in the show notes. And anyway, I love this conversation.
Thanks so much for having me. This has been wonderful.
Excellent. I enjoyed the conversation too, Paul. I really hope that you're able to get the word out, maybe get some more volunteers, and come back and tell us about your next big success stories, because need to keep you in the public eye.
Wonderful. Thanks again.
It's really great to have uplifting stories, Chris, and I think the mental health of our veterans when they return from intense, serious positions overseas, and then they come back and are trying to figure out what to do next. I just think this idea of volunteering for disaster relief makes a whole lot of sense. I'm so glad we got to hear about it.
Yeah, absolutely. It not only adds a sense of continued public service for our veterans, but also something close to home. And you hear in the U.S. stories of people whose careers take them to the National Guard because of this kind of emergency response work. We're just lucky not to lose all that training and all that know-how, but most importantly, that desire for service and help neighbors helping neighbors. It's a great story, and I really hope it spreads imitators and we can get more people involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And these fires in Canada are historic and they're devastating. Maybe something else we can put in the show notes is the New York Times story about the French firefighters that were in Quebec and have never seen anything like the boreal forest on fire in their lives. So we'll link that as well. But anyway, Chris, always good to see you on Canusa Street, my friend.
Always good to see you too, and I'm worried that we'll have more stories like this because we'll have more crises because of climate change and the way in which natural disasters are becoming more frequent. So let's hope for good weather on Canusa Street for now, but we'll come back as things get worse.
That's right. Thanks a lot. See you soon.
This podcast is brought to you by the Canadian American Business Council and the Wilson Center. If you like this episode, help others find our show and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.